Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming for joining the virtual press briefing on the June 2020 inflation report. Please note that we will be streaming this live through our Facebook page, Philippine Statistics Authority. I'm Lady Tuble and I'm your moderator for today. With us is National Statistician and Civil Registrar General, Undersecretary Dennis Mapa, to present the June 2020 inflation report.
Good morning, everyone. The Philippine Statistics Authority is pleased to report the inflation rate of the Philippines for June 2020. The country's headline inflation in June 2020 went up to 2.5% after 4 consecutive months of deceleration. This makes the year-to-date inflation for June 2020 at 2.5%. In May 2020, inflation was posted at 2.1%, and in June 2019 at 2.7%. The main source of the upward trend in June 2020 inflation was the annual increase in the transport index. Specifically, double-digit annual hike was recorded in the index of tricycle fare at 26% in June 2020 from 6.6% in May 2020. Annual increment was also higher in the index of bicycle and tricycle at 7.5% in June 2020 from 5.3% in May 2020. Moreover, the index of petroleum and fuels for personal transport equipment declined at a slower rate of 15.1% in June from the annual drop of 28.8% in May 2020. The higher annual rate in alcoholic beverages and tobacco index also pushed up the overall inflation in June 2020. Specifically, annual increments were higher in the following commodities: cigarettes at 22.7% in June 2020 from 22.2% in May 2020, beer 7.2% from 6.5%, and brandy 6.7% from 6.3%. Annual increase in the index of housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels also contributed to the uptrend in the inflation in June 2020. This was due to the increment in the annual rates posted in the following commodities: LPG at 1.7% in June from negative 6.3% in May, kerosene negative 19% in June 2020 from negative 31.7% in May 2020, and fuel wood 7.4% from 6.9%. For the food groups, rice and sugar remained at downtrend, with rice declining at 1.9% and sugar at 0.7%. Slower annual upticks were noted in the following food groups: other cereals, flour, cereal preparation, bread, pasta, and other bakery products at 2.6% in June from 2.7% in May. Fish, 6.1% from 8.1%. Fruits at 10% from 11.3%. Vegetables at 4.8% from 7.3%. And food products not classified elsewhere, such as calamansi, at 5.5% from 6.3%. Higher annual hikes were noted in the following food groups: corn, which climbed by 0.6% in June 2020 after exhibiting annual decreases for 16 consecutive months; meat, 3.4%, and oils and fats at 2.2%. Meanwhile, the annual rate of the index for milk, cheese, and eggs remained at 3.5%. Among the 11 major commodity groups, the top contributor to the June 2020 inflation was food and non-alcoholic beverages with an annual rate of 2.7% and a share of 45.5% to the overall inflation. Contributing largely to the inflation for food and non-alcoholic beverages were the following food groups: fish, specifically dilis and galunggong at 6.1% inflation and a 38.3% share. Meat, such as beef and chicken, at 3.4% inflation and 23.3% share, and fruits, particularly mango and banana, at 10.0% inflation and a 15.3% share. The second commodity group that largely contributed to the overall inflation was alcoholic beverages and tobacco with 18.5% inflation and a 12.9% share to the overall inflation in June 2020. Specific commodities that contributed to the June 2020 inflation of alcoholic beverages and tobacco were the following: cigarettes at 22.7% inflation and 78.8% share. Beer at 7.2% inflation and 7.6% share. And rum at 12.9% inflation and a 4.2% share. The third major contributor to the overall inflation in June 2020 was restaurant and miscellaneous goods and services, which recorded an inflation of 2.3% and a share of 12.7% to the overall inflation. The commodities that mainly contributed to the June 2020 inflation for restaurants and miscellaneous goods and services were the following: meals, 2.1% inflation and a 58.7% share; personal care at 2.7% inflation and 35.6% share; and personal effects, 1.8% inflation and a 3.6% share. As mentioned earlier, the uptrend in the June 2020 inflation was primarily brought about by the annual increment in the transport index at 2.3% from a negative 5.6% in May 2020. In addition, annual increases were higher in the indices of alcoholic beverages and tobacco at 18.5% and in housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels, and communication, both at 0.4% share. Meanwhile, annual markups slowed down in the indices of the following commodity groups: food and non-alcoholic beverages, 2.7%; recreation and culture, 1.2%; education, 1.6%; and restaurant and miscellaneous goods and services at 2.3%. On the other hand, the following commodity groups retained their May 2020 annual growth rates: clothing and footwear at 2.4%, furnishing, household equipment, and routine maintenance of the house at 4.1%, and health at 2.8%. Inflation in the National Capital Region climbed further to 2.0% in June 2020. In May 2020, inflation in the NCR stood at 1.4%, and in June 2019 at 3.0%. Inflation in the NCR was pushed up by the 8.6% annual hike in the transport index in June 2020 from an annual drop of 1.8% in May 2020. Moreover, annual growth rates were higher in the indices of alcoholic beverages and tobacco at 13.9% and recreation and culture at 0.8%. Among the food groups in the National Capital Region, annual decreases were noted in the indices of rice, at negative 0.9%, corn 4.8% negative, and sugar minus 1.4%. Annual increments in the following food groups decelerated in the National Capital Region. Other cereals, flour, cereal preparation, bread, pasta, and other bakery products at 1.9%. Fish, particularly lapu-lapu and dalagang bukid at 1.4%. Cheese, milk, and egg, 2.6%. Fruits like apple and papaya, 6.7%. And vegetables, specifically tomatoes and string beans, at 4.8%. Meanwhile, annual increases were higher in meat, such as chicken and pork, at 4.6%, and in food products not elsewhere classified, particularly ginger, at 4.0%. The index of oils and fats remained at its May 2020 inflation at 1.3%. Similar to the trend exhibited at the national level, inflation in the areas outside the National Capital Region accelerated to 2.7% in June after 4 successive months of deceleration. Inflation in this area was 2.2% in May 2020, while in June 2019, it was noted at 2.6%. Among the regions in areas outside the National Capital Region, the highest inflation was observed in Region 5, Bicol Region, at 4.3%. Inflation in the area was lower at 2.9% in May 2020. Meanwhile, the lowest inflation among the regions in areas outside the National Capital Region in June 2020 was seen in Region 8, Eastern Visayas, at 1.1%. Its annual rate in May 2020 was higher at 1.8%. 11 regions in areas outside the National Capital Region had higher inflation in June, and these are the orange shaded regions. 3 regions had lower annual increments, which are the regions in green, and the rest, which are the regions in purple, retained their May 2020 inflation rate. The inflation for the bottom 30% income households at the national level was posted at 3.0% in June 2020. This was the highest inflation for this income group of consumers since July last year. In May 2020, inflation for the bottom 30% income household was recorded at 2.9%, and in June 2019 at 3.1%. Data on inflation for the bottom 30% income households for June 2020 are posted at the Philippine Statistics Authority website simultaneous with the release of the June 2020 inflation for all income households. This concludes my presentation on the inflation in the Philippines for June 2020. We appreciate your participation in this video conference. Thank you very much and good morning.
Thank you very much, USEC Mapa. May we please refer you to the link and the QR code being presented for easy access to the information presented before. Now we will open the floor for questions. For those joining us virtually, you may raise your hand on Zoom or you may chat your question on the chat box. We now open the floor for questions. Okay. From Jerome Morales, from Reuters News, may we ask for the June 2020 month-on-month inflation that is not seasonally adjusted?
Well, for May 2020, it's 2.1, and June 2020 is 2.5. So no seasonal adjustment. It's a 0.4% increase.
Thank you, Yusek Dennis. Next question is from Mr. Ben De Vera.
Hi, sir. Good morning. I'm just curious, sir, if we can attribute the faster increases of food prices and also transport costs to the less restrictive GCQ or MGCQ in various parts of the country.
Yes, partly, particularly since parts of the country are opening up, and you have tricycle. No, we've seen a really high increase in the tricycle fare, registering a 26.0% increase. So you have movements of our citizens. So this, in a way, caused the increase, and of course, the limited transportation during the transition from ECQ to GCQ.
Okay, thank you very much for the question from Mr. Ben De Vera. Next question is from Mr. Warren De Guzman.
Hello, good morning, Mapa. I just wanted to ask regarding the health inflation that remained stable. Uh, could you go into further detail on that? Because this is a key a concern right now, especially with COVID-19. And then I also wondered if you were able to capture in your data prices online for all the goods, or have you yet to do, or have you yet to start doing that? Thank you.
Okay, 2 points. One on the health, we covered a number of items in the health index, and we are tracking this on a monthly basis, and we've seen that the movement is relatively stable. On your second question, on the online prices, our data collection actually includes online prices. So for health index, this includes medicine, outpatient, and hospital services. Inflation, as I mentioned, was the same for May at 2.8%, and this is exhibited both at the National Capital Region, which is 2.1% annual rate for the health index, and for areas outside the National Capital Region is slightly higher at 3.1% in June. So those are the numbers for the health index.
Just to follow up, Yusek, does this also include PPE, or was PPE an item before?
No,
Because PPE,
we don't have the PPEs, except the item in the health index would include alcohol, but not PPE.
will you be monitoring that moving forward, sir? Because this is now a charge that's figures very largely in expenses these days.
2012. This is a 2012 base, right? Yeah, this is a 2012 base. Remember, the inflation rate is 2012 base year, so consumption is actually based on 2012 consumption. So those are the items. But yes, in the next adjustment, this will be considered when we rebase. That is.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sir Warren. We have a follow-up question from Mr. Ben De Vera.
Hi, sorry, I had difficulty unmuting myself. But sir, what is can you also provide figures on the inflation on education, because classes were delayed? So can we say that prices are? I mean, can you describe what happened to the inflation in the yeah, in the education index? Thank you, sir.
Okay. The first, the weight of the education index in the overall inflation is 3.26%, and in June it's about 1.6% inflation rate. So you're right. This is slow compared to May, and I think this is also due to the delay in the opening. So purchases of school items might have been delayed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. De Vera. Next question is from Mr. Ralph Rivas. Can we attribute higher cost of tricycle due to limited buses and no jeepneys? And what does the latest inflation report tell us about the lockdown relaxation? Has transport of goods improved?
As I noted in the report, the tricycle fare in particular increased this month by 26%. And we've seen that under the transport index, this is primarily the mode of transportation of low-income households, and it contributes a significant increase in the overall transport index, which in turn contributed to that hike of about 0.4% in the overall inflation.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Rivas. From Ms. Shariza Valencia of Philippine Star. Can we expect a steady uptrend in inflation beginning June as the economy reopens?
All right. Right now, the food index, which is the index with the biggest share in the overall inflation, is still downward. So it's 2.7% from about 2.9%. And we're still seeing, for example, downward trend in several of the food items. But of course, there are items that are starting to increase, like as we discussed a while ago, meat, chicken, pork. So these are items that would contribute to an increase in the inflation rate because of the bigger weight. The second group with the relatively higher weights would be, of course, in the housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels. So that one, if there's a movement upward, that would surely contribute to the increase in the next month's inflation.
Thank you, sir. The next question we have is once again from Mr. Bendevera.
Hi, sir. I'm just curious if your data gathering could reflect specifically, for example, with tricycles. I'm not sure, but in most areas, I think the fares are regulated, so they set the fares at a standard level, or they cap it. But during the easing of the quarantine, have you seen any incidents or instances wherein the drivers perhaps adjusted it because they can only accommodate just perhaps one or two given two passengers given the physical distancing restriction. So can you discuss more what exactly happened with regards to transport costs? What are the unique, perhaps if there are anything you have during your data gathering you have observed in terms of how Filipinos use transport during the opening up of the economy? Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ben. Our data showed that there is an increase in the fare. Of course, this is from our survey. So, for example, at the National Capital Region, where I have the data, the month-on-month growth rate on the average fare for tricycle, minimum charge per passenger increased. This is month-on-month from May by 43.7%, about 44%, month-on-month minimum fare per passenger. So we checked the data. So for example, it's about 12 pesos, and now it's about 17 pesos. That is month-on-month. If we go year-on-year, NCR, on June 2020, the average price of tricycle fare, which is the minimum charge per passenger, increased by 129.3%. So yes, it is possible because of the social distancing guidelines. They may accommodate only a single passenger. That's why they are adjusting the price. But that is what we have observed from the data. And this is true not only at the NCR, but also in key cities in the regions, like, for example, Bicol. So you've seen the Bicol region with the highest inflation for this month across the regions, and partly that is also due to transport index, primarily the tricycle fare.
Thank you, sir. Any more questions? Last call for questions. All right, since there are no more questions, thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's virtual session. We hope to see you again next month as we present the July 2020 inflation. Good morning, everyone.